Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. This is the second one this year in the series of IOI CPD webinars that set out to navigate key themes in the global ocean governance landscape. I will now introduce Antonella Vassallo. She's Managing Director at IOI HQ. And she will give a little bit of an introduction how this topic came about.
Okay, thank you, Cosmin. I think you're familiar to many of our people attending here today because this is the second quarterly seminar this year, but it's actually the sixth in a series. So I'm glad to see many familiar people, faces, or logins joining us, and also to welcome people who are maybe new to this series to join us today. As Cosmin mentioned, Cosmin, our moderator, is also an alumnus himself, but these webinars are created for people who have graduated from IOI training courses principally, but also and have opened them more recently to other early career ocean practitioners. All in all, the audience tends to be a body of people who are well-versed in ocean governance issues, who know the background to many of the topics. And so we try to bring to you some cutting-edge expertise to speak about or maybe develop more on the thematics that are coming across our kind of research horizons, our expectation horizons, new developments in the ocean governance world, etc. What we are trying to do more generally this year, but very specifically for these particular webinars, these last couple of webinars, is to focus a lot on the ocean-climate interaction. Today, we have 3 experts joining us who are part of the expert pool that has produced the latest World Ocean Review. Those of you who follow IOI know that the World Ocean Review is a publication which the IOI is a partner in. They're very good publications. They feature consortia of scientists who gather the latest information around cutting-edge topics. World Ocean Review 8 deals, in fact, with climate and ocean. Our 3 scientists today are going to deal with that, are going to examine aspects of the climate-ocean interaction. What can we do? Should we do anything? And for those of you who would like more information and maybe a free download copy of the book itself, please take a look in the chat where Diane has included a link to the book, which you'll be able to download and look through afterwards. But I also invite you to take advantage of the presence of our experts here today and ask your burning questions directly to them after their presentations have been done. So thank you for being here today. Cosmin is our very able moderator, so I hand the floor back to him and to the speakers. I really hope you enjoy and you profit from this discussion as much as I'm looking forward to it myself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonella, for the introduction. I also reiterate that you are encouraged to engage actively with today's speakers and ask questions. You can either do this in the chat tab or the Q&A tab at the top. At the end, we'll try to take as many questions as time will allow. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker for today, who is Professor Andreas Oschilius. He is a Nerve Systems modeler at the GeoMar Helmholtz Center for Ocean Research in Kiel, and co-chair of the German CDR Mare research mission that investigates marine carbon sinks in decarbonization pathways.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cosmin, and sorry that I cannot share the slides directly, so we cooperate this via the internet, and I hope you can share. So I would like to give you some overview of marine carbon sinks and the role the ocean could play in decarbonization pathways. So could we use the ocean in some ways to help removing CO2 from the atmosphere, where we have the current problem, where we have global warming, driven mostly by CO2, and where we have to do something about it to avoid further damages to the climate, to the environment, but also to social systems, society. So next slide, please. We have agreed, and society has agreed to mitigation, strong mitigation, and most scenarios we have worldwide, but also in individual countries, look like this. This is an ambitious emission pathway. So rapid reduction in this century of emissions, shown here in gray, and the CO2 emissions, fossil fuels, and some land use change in brown, plus the yellow part, that's non-CO2 greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide primarily. And they all are supposed to decline very rapidly. That's what we all have promised. But we already know, or we don't know how to reduce them to zero. So we basically know there will be leftover positive emissions to the right of this scale at the end of the century. There's a gray part still available. We can reduce that hopefully by much more than 90%. But there's a more substantial yellow bar, the non-CO2 greenhouse gases coming, methane and nitrous oxide, mostly from agriculture, which of course we can't run down. We need agriculture to feed the world population. And so that will continue to emit greenhouse gases. So we will not reach this net zero that is already embedded in the Paris Agreement, net zero greenhouse gas emissions, which is required on a physical basis to stop global warming. And so we will have to compensate those residual emissions by so-called negative emissions or by CO2 removals from the atmosphere. Right now, CO2 is the only gas where we have some idea how to remove it from the atmosphere. We have no means to remove nitrous oxide. We have some small ideas or first ideas how to remove methane, but we expect that we will have to compensate all greenhouse gas emissions by removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And it's estimated to be about at least 10% of current emissions, so it's substantial. Next slide, please. There's some, next click, yes. There's some issues about reaching net zero, and we have to reach net zero CO2 about a decade earlier than net zero greenhouse gases. So that's important for all policymakers. Usually we have net zero greenhouse gases in our legal instruments, but that means really we have to meet net zero CO2 much earlier. So balancing only CO2 emissions and not the other greenhouse gases has to happen a decade earlier. But this is also a figure from the last IPCC report. So this CO2 carbon dioxide removal is really, according to best scientific knowledge, unavoidable if we want to ever reach net zero emissions and thereby stop global warming. So we have to do it. We'll have to do it. Next slide, please. And why the ocean? Why the hell the ocean? It's the ocean is the biggest carbon pool moving around on the planet. That's all the blue part of this pie chart here. It's carbon dissolved in the ocean. The small gray wedge at the top, that's the atmosphere and the carbon content in the atmosphere. That's what we right now perturb by the red arrow, by our emissions. And we expand this gray wedge by some, almost 30% already. And so the idea is, why not use the blue part and move some of the gray into the blue, where relative perturbations damages may be much smaller than by expanding the gray part. And we also can use the orange part, that's mostly soils on land and some vegetation as well. Next click, please. And this, we know this has happened many times on Earth during the geological past. So whenever we had pulses of CO2 emissions during continental breakup, volcanic emissions, real climate catastrophes happened. So we had rapid warming, we also had mass extinctions, many very nasty things happened. But in the end, we are still here. So the climate it was possible to have a thermostat operating on Earth, and the ocean essentially removed most of all these CO2 pulses in the past. Next click, please. We know biology, first by photosynthesis, removes a tiny bit really. Next click. Then we have the ocean just invasion into a CO2 gas into the ocean. That's what we do in mineral water. We pump CO2 into water. That also happens in the atmosphere. If we increase CO2 partial pressure in the atmosphere, it will, part of the CO2 will, via gas exchange, enter the ocean and then be distributed in the ocean via ocean circulation. Next click, please. And in the end, we have chemistry. And that's dissolving carbonate sediments or coral reefs or shellfish. And that's what also is happening now with ocean acidification. And this is basically an acid-base reaction. It's carbonic acid, CO2 in the ocean, dissolved in the ocean, disappears by compensation with basic rocks, calcium carbonate rocks in most cases. And this, in the end, ensures that all CO2 pulses in the atmosphere will eventually be removed by the ocean, taken care of by the ocean. But this takes long time periods, 10 to 100,000 of years in the geological past. And the idea here is, do we have any means to use that to solve parts of our current climate problem and accelerate this ocean uptake of CO2 and neutralization of carbonic acid in the ocean? Next click, please. And this is where many ideas now have been generated and are being generated. So we have a couple of sketches. It's just a sketch of ideas here. And I will talk you through a few classes of ideas very briefly. Next click, please. So first we have biological ideas. This is first the physical ideas, storage of CO2 in geological formation. That's basically where it came from, fossil fuels, and pump part of this back into these reservoirs or into other geological reservoirs. And here the ocean can play, or the sediments and rocks below the ocean can play an important role, because it's first the largest area of the surface of the planet. But it also adds an extra safety layer, namely the water, that can be used to better shield and secure CO2 is locked up in these geological reservoirs. Come to that a little bit later. Next click, please. And then we have biology, like afforestation on land. We could also try to increase primary production, photosynthetic uptake of CO2 in ocean areas. Next click. And at last, we have chemistry in the ocean. That's what we call ocean alkalinity enhancement or alkalization, where we have means to change the chemistry in a way to reduce ocean acidification and to remove carbonic acid, and thereby in the end increase the uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere. So let's start, next click, with biology. And this has a pretty long history already. Iron fertilization has been done about 20 years ago in field experiments. These are all the field trials that have been performed in the ocean, where research vessels went out, released iron sulfide into the water, just any garden fertilizer would do. They all have iron to make photosynthesis happening faster in your garden, but you could do it in the ocean, and that can even be seen from satellite. If you dump a few tons of fertilizer, you see a large spatial scales, blooms, particularly in iron-limited regions of the ocean, otherwise iron-limited, far away from sediments, from coasts, from perturbation, pollution from land. That's mostly the Southern Ocean. Next click, please. And these have been, it does work, but of course, as any fertilization, it changes ecology. It introduces new species, it shifts the winners and losers. It also consumes oxygen at depth when the fertilized algae sink down and are respired. It changes, it attracts animals, different animals, so it has ecological impacts on purpose. And there are a couple of questions. How durable is this? Is the CO2 sequestered for very long times, or will it come back next year when winter mixing brings up deeper water and all these respired CO2? The main result of this, I think, is that we have an international governance scheme in place. The London Convention and London Protocol took this up and added an extra paragraph, different interpretation of precautionary approach. But the result is right now, we are not allowed to fertilize the ocean other than for small-scale scientific experiments. These can be possibly allowed to increase the knowledge base on the scientific understanding. Otherwise, we have a worldwide regulation of these activity in the ocean to protect the ocean environment from, well, commercial activities that may not deliver on climate what they promise. So we need better understanding here. But this, the RED international governance scheme, is the main success here. And this will now influence other schemes, other ideas to use the ocean as well for climate mitigation and CO2 uptake. Next slide, please. So we do have like macroalgae farming, that's mostly in often in coastal waters. Many ideas are there to farm different different parts of the ecosystem, mostly photosynthetic organism, green stuff that takes up CO2. Next slide, please. All these have in common, if they work, they change ecosystems. So we will replace some existing system. Next slide, please. And they all try to remove, in the end, organic matter that has taken up some CO2 via photosynthesis down into the deep ocean, as shown on the left part here. So either increase biomass, that's number one, or increase sinking speed by restructuring the ecosystem, that's number two. So removing more organic carbon from the surface of the ocean, where we have gas exchange with the atmosphere, to the deep ocean, where it might be stored for years or for centuries or for millennia perhaps. The disadvantage that all these methods have is that's on the right slide here, they move CO2 from the surface ocean, where photosynthesis is taking place, to the deep ocean, where respiration occurs. So we basically have an acidification issue in the deep ocean. More CO2 is moved to the deep ocean, pumped into the deep ocean, and respiration consumes oxygen, so oxygen will decline in the deep ocean. This is also, if these methods work, will be the result of these methods. So changes both on the surface ocean, but also on the deep ocean. Next slide, please. And this could be compared with direct injection of CO2 that was studied some 30 years ago, where some companies tried or thought about pumping CO2 directly, not into sediment, into geological reservoirs, but into the deep water. This was very quickly banned, also by the London Convention Protocol, because it was believed harmful. It is harmful to local organisms there. If we compare that with the biological methods, if they work, they would do the same to the CO2. So they would acidify the deep ocean. But in addition, they would also consume oxygen, so deoxygenize the deep ocean. So they would have an additional negative impact on the deep ocean compared to this direct injection of liquid, of compressed CO2, which is forbidden. So then let's put some questions to what these biological methods how they should be governed if we have already governed and forbidden one of these direct injection methods. So big question mark to biological methods. If they work well, they could do more harm than things we do not allow. Next slide, please. This is different than for biological methods called blue carbon. They do not store things in the water column. They store carbon in the sediments underneath. So in this basically soils in the ocean. This is salt marshes, seagrass meadows, and mangroves. They grow sediment. They grow carbon that does not immediately respire, that can be locked up as organic carbon, as this black substance in the sediments for long periods of time. And these, next click, please. All these systems are extremely productive per square meter. They are much more productive and sequester more carbon than any ecosystems on land, maybe except from peatlands that can do that as well. But forests or other things we now culture in order to remove CO2 from the atmosphere are per square meter usually less efficient than these marine ecosystems. Globally, we don't have that much surface where these systems can grow. It's shallow water, coastal waters, but some states have large coastal regions and they can really benefit from that in terms of carbon uptake, CO2 uptake, and carbon storage in the sediments. Of course, we have to protect these systems, make sure they can sustain heat waves and anthropogenic perturbations. But this is locally can be very important. Globally, it will not save the world because the area is too small and the amount of carbon we can store is too small, but it I think it should be done. It's a low-hanging fruit if done correctly. Next slide, please. So this is last biological idea to go to the open ocean, do artificial upwelling, create passive pumps, wave-driven, renewable energy-driven pumps to foster biological production, bring up nutrients into the light, and thereby take up CO2. Here, the technological feasibility is very unclear. Next slide, please. We have done one field experiment in one of our recent projects, and we think it's too difficult right now technologically, and the sign of the CO2 flux even is not clear. Next slide, please. And but a major disadvantage is the technology that is required in a very harsh environment. You have to install pumps, and usually these break after a few hours to days, maybe weeks, but so far that hasn't been overly successful. Next slide, please. So this is, well, might be happening in a few decades, but I don't see that can be installed in the next few years because of these technological challenges and still incomplete scientific understanding. Next slide, please. This is storage and geological. I just want to mention that very briefly. Geological reservoirs under the sea. It is being done in many countries, including Europe, North Sea. Norway has done it for more than 25 years on a 1 million ton per year scale, and other countries explore this. Next slide, please. What is not so certain is the safety here. There are leakages, old boreholes or fracture zones, and research, what we are doing in our projects right now is mostly try to find better monitoring systems, detection of leakages. In the ocean, that's pretty easy because gas bubbles can have an acoustic signal. If you have your bicycle tire, you usually put it into water because that's much easier to find a leak there than over land. And the same holds for CO2 storage systems. That's the ocean adds another safety layer here. But again, the environment is challenging. We have to need to monitor it, have extra instruments which we operate in this harsh environment. I think the research is doing pretty well, and we are on track to be able to monitor eventually possible leakages and thereby have a strong safety requirements that we can fulfill to really operate such systems in the near future. Next slide, please. And then the last method or family of methods is chemical methods. Next slide, please. Ocean alkalinity enhancement. What is it? So that's what we know from our home. We have limestone or calcium carbonate precipitation in the bathroom and kitchen. Next slide, please. What we do, we put an acid on it and rub it, and then within a minute it's both gone. Next click, please. In the ocean, the same happens from a CO2 perspective. CO2 is invading the ocean from the atmosphere via this pressure increase in the atmosphere. Next click, please. So the ocean acidifies and it slowly starts dissolving coral reefs and other carbonate-containing animals, but also carbonate sediments. So this happens, but it takes, as I said early on, about 100,000 years. So we could speed it up. Next click, please. By increasing, next click, the contact surface between minerals and water. This can be done either by grinding minerals, basic minerals, throwing them onto the beach, into the water, in chemical reactors. Next click, please. Or using residuals from the limestone cement industry, which is often very fine powder. Next click. Or going into facilities where we pump a lot of water already, like desalination plants, and there could change the alkalinity of the water, the pH, in order to remove carbonic acid from the system and allow more CO2 invading the ocean again from the atmosphere. Next click, please. So a lot of mineral is required here, about, well, 1 or a few tons rock per ton of CO2. So it would be a huge industry. And we have to, from a scientific perspective, we have to understand, does it work? Does it remove CO2? And what are the ecological impacts? And we do that in these enclosed systems that right now are put in the Kiel Bay here into the ocean, where we test this. We we dissolve different minerals there, and we see, yes, CO2 is invading the ocean. It does work from a climate perspective. And we think we have a range where we can reduce the ecological impacts to acceptable amounts that mostly work back towards pre-industrial conditions. So we have so far not detected environmental harm that we think is unacceptable. But still, this is early stages, and we have to test it and be sure that environmental damage could be limited to acceptable levels. The climate signal, yes, that has been proven. It could work. And next slide, please. And we see this also in natural environments like the Baltic coast, where we have limestones around the sea. These dissolve, coastal erosion is happening, and we see these limestones, they really disappear in deeper waters that are very acidic. These are anoxic waters, and you see they become more and more acidic, more anoxic over time, over the last century. So in these areas, limestone does dissolve, and we don't even have to process it much. So this would be a relatively easy, low-hanging fruit to use that system. Next and last slide, please. So what do we think? What options does the ocean provide? It does provide the blue carbon option in many coastal states. It does work. It does store carbon in the sediments, but the option is limited to, well, maybe a billion tons CO2 per year globally. But it produces little harm if done correctly. And it can be significant for many countries with large coastal areas, but not for all countries, and particularly like for enclosed landlocked countries, it's not an option. Next click, please. The other option is really chemistry. It doesn't look as attractive as biology. Biology is often green and natural, but chemistry is also natural, of course. But it's often easier to control the biology. We don't have evolution, we don't have viruses coming through, so it's just chemical equations, often very well understood. Next click, please. And here, ocean alkalinity enhancement appears the method with the largest potential. So it has been had worked on the planet in the past to end climate catastrophes in the past. And we have to make sure that the ecological impacts can be small enough, and they appear to be small, and in the direction of towards pre-industrial stage. So reducing acidification, moving towards higher pH levels again, so reducing the acidity of the water. But it requires large mining and transport operations, similar to today's coal mining operations globally, if we want to make a significant impact on CO2 uptake. Next click, please. And here's a few new options on the horizon now coming using electrochemistry. That's also what you could have in mind if you have stranded or energy and wind farms. You can't use all the electricity. Some of this might be used for electrolysis, provide green hydrogen, but also to change the pH system of the water. So basically the separation of acids and bases in the water by electrolysis. This can be done in a way to make the ocean absorb more CO2. But it doesn't come, there's no free lunch, so there's some acid waste problem here. But this might be promising. It could avoid mining and transport of rocks on land and go mostly to the ocean if you have enough electricity and if you have some storage space for the acid that is produced during this process. So that was a tour de force through a few ideas around right now. So don't neglect the ocean's possible contribution to decarbonization pathways. The ocean has done it all in the past, in the geological past of the planet. Otherwise, we would not be here to listen to talks like this. And the question here is also, does chemistry win over biology? So biology looks attractive, sounds attractive, we like it, but chemistry might be easier to control, easier to avoid damages, and easier to stop if things go wrong. Stopping biology if things go wrong is very, very difficult. Okay, that's it from me. Thanks for your attention, and I look forward to questions. Well, first to the next talks and to questions later on.
Thank you very much, Professor Chiles, for the truly a tour de force through decades of research. I think what's clear from your presentation is that there is no silver bullet, but there is the potential, and with the proper scientific research and backing, perhaps even multiple approaches can be engaged at the same time, provided that they do not create an even bigger issue.
Yes, we will have to use different methods. There's no single method right now on the horizon that we can rely on and that could do it all. But we also have to make sure what do we do if things go wrong? And things will go wrong. So we have to always be very, very careful. We have to be able to stop things, to have safety guards and, well, red lines that if we should not cross. And we have to be able to stop any operation if things go wrong.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we're going to have interesting questions in the chat at the end in the Q&A session. I will now introduce our second speaker for today, Dr. Christine Merck, who is Deputy Director of the Research Center, Global Commons and Climate Policy at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Her research focuses on public perceptions of new technologies, such as ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. Dr. Merck, you may have the floor.
I think it should be my slides now. That should be possible. And thank you for the kind introduction, and also thank you for having me. And as Andreas has now provided a tour de force of everything that's natural science in this, we look at something that's only briefly mentioned in the World Ocean Report. It's what does the public think about marine CDR? The World Ocean Report mentions several times that it's important to engage with publics to gauge a bit the political feasibility and what do actually people think who might be affected, or also people in general think about marine CDR. So I will now tell you a bit about the research I've done on this and the results we found, and then Lucas later on will tell a bit more about why that might be important. So I'm also part of the CDMR program, but here I present results from another project, which is an EU Horizon 2020 project, Ocean Nets, and is joint work together with Gisle Andersen, Asta Nure, and Returnerein. So, but as a starter, what do we know about public perceptions of marine CDR? So just 3 weeks ago, the State of CDR report came out, and this is a figure from this report. And there you see the public perceptions work on different CDR methods. And it rather clearly shows that both also, which you don't see here, in the natural sciences, but also in the public perceptions work, the focus is strongly on land-based options. Only a very small share here on top is about marine CDR, so it's about 10%, and it's mostly about coastal wetland restoration. It's not really open ocean. And there's a few ocean fertilization studies where people are asked how they feel about it, and now only in the past 1 or 2 years, studies about ocean alkalinity enhancement and its perceptions came up. This is one of the foci, so we know very little about what people think of it. And on the other hand, they also do a split up of geographical locations of the study. And you can see that there's a lot of focus, and I'll start using my pointer, in Western Europe and Northern America, so developed countries. There's basically no studies, very few studies in Africa, some in Oceania, and here's few in Southeast Asia, but then these are probably also land-based and often focusing on afforestation back from the days when there was a REDD+ program and afforestation programs were en vogue, so to say. So there's very little known. But on the other hand, we know from experience that in the past there have been a lot of protests against marine CDR projects or research projects especially. So here, for example, you see reporting on a study in 2002 where there was the attempt to do experiment and direct injection into the ocean. These experiments were halted. There were a German experiment that was a German vessel from the Alfred Wegener Institute wanted to do ocean iron fertilization experiments in the Southern Ocean. It was halted in between and then started again, but was quite some controversy around it. And also another very, very famous case in Canada, which is basically two cases, is Russ George trying in 2012, together with the Haida-Gwaii, which is the First Nation in Canada, who live on an island of the western coast of Canada. And he promised them, we will rejuvenate your salmon around you, the habitats around, and you might also make money from international carbon markets when we do ocean iron fertilization. None of this came true, and there was quite some controversy of how he dealt with the indigenous people and how they felt they were not well treated or they were lied to, because really the promises didn't come through. And another project, so these is all like 2012, or the other one 2017, but also just last year. Now we see another spike in new startups coming up trying to do marine CDR or proposing projects. And on the right-hand side, you see something here in Cornwall, where the startup Planetary wanted to work together with a wastewater sewage plant and treat the water that's actually left into the bay. And then the public or the media got wind of it, and they were really outraged. You can see the pictures here. There were a lot of protests. And as of now, these trials have been abandoned, and this site will probably not be used by Planetary. So there is a lot of controversy about the topic, and this controversy stems from the media, from environmental NGOs, but also from the public that live there. And so it is relevant what the public thinks, because we might have controversy, we might have opposition from it. So diving down into our research, in our project, we did quite a few different studies, and I will only show you the results of one, but I will also summarize the results in the end of all of what we did. And we started out with focus groups, so with in-depth discussions to find out what people feel about various technologies, what their associations are, what they think about when they hear about these technologies for the first time. We also did a deliberative survey. This means there's a 4-hour online discussion between participants and also question and answers with experts. And we ask a survey before and after to find out whether this deliberation changes anything in the views of participants of marine CDR options. And there we also have the comparison between land-based options and marine options, so to see, do people make a difference between whether it's on land or in the ocean? And in the end, we did a cross-country survey, and there I'll now dive deeper into the results, because this is what I'll be talking about mainly. The countries were Canada, China, France, Germany, Norway, and Taiwan. So we chose these countries because of some of the controversies that had been out there before, as I just shown you. And we also broadened the geographical scope, not just to have Western countries, but also find out whether China or Taiwan might feel different about various technologies. The methods are ocean alkalinity enhancement, seaweed farming with sinking, and seaweed farming with BECCS. So doing marine biomass and cultivating marine biomass to then use it in bioenergy production and capture the CO2. So the seaweed, the 2 seaweed versions we included, so we have a co-benefit in energy production with the marine BECCS, while we don't have a co-benefit. We only, if at all, have CO2 capture with the seaweed farming and sinking. We did the field phase in end of March to April 23. So about last year, we have about 2,000 observations per country, and the samples are representative for the population that is active online based on their age, gender, and education. That means the people we ask are in the tendency a bit younger and a bit more educated compared to the overall population in the country. So for example, my parents are 78, they don't have internet access, so they are not part of the online population, and they are thus underrepresented, as their age group more often doesn't have internet access. And in China, we had to restrict the sample to the eastern parts, so the big cities around the coast, because it's more difficult for our online collab or for our online panel providers to recruit people in the western parts of China. So with these 2 caveats, the knowledge are the first kinds of results. So as I said before, no one has ever heard about this, or hardly anyone. Like Andreas, Lucas, and I, we're living in a bubble where we talk about this a lot, but we always have to get back to no one knows about it. And this is one of the results that we always ask. So here we see, for example, in Germany, despite our best efforts in the research programs we're in, 84% say they've never heard about anything like it. And this is getting a bit less. In Norway, for example, there's been a history of liming rivers and lakes in the 80s and 90s to counteract acid rain back in the times. And there's more knowledge in China and Taiwan. But responses from Eastern cultures, we often have to take a bit with a grain of salt, because it's a more problematic for them to own up to not knowing something. So that in China, 44% say they've never heard about it is already quite a substantial share, given that they're often less willing to say, I have never heard about this. So, and as this is the case, no one's ever heard about this, we always have to provide people and respondents with information. And here you see the example for ocean liming. So we try to keep it very short and very simple. So it's only a brief description of what it is. But what was important to us to always say, okay, what would be a co-benefit? And in this case, it would be counteracting ocean acidification, so the co-benefit on top of removing CO2, but also that there would be side effects on land, as the rock would have to be mined and new quarries would have to be created. It could be energy intensive if the rock has to be ground. And also there's a lot of knowledge we still don't have about what the effect of marine animals or plants would be. So any of the highlighting that is there is done by me just for the presentation. It wasn't in the survey. So this is just similar in the structure for the two other technologies. And then we have a question whether people feel rather negative or rather positive if their country would actually start doing this to remove CO2. And what's very important, we always include a no opinion and don't know answer. So people can say, I have no idea. I cannot make up my mind about this, because it's okay not to make your mind about it, something you've just read about. So here's the result for this specific question. And you see that here at the right-hand side, we have kind of around 20%, depending on the country you're in, that say I have no opinion or I don't know. And again, fewer in Taiwan and China. What you also see is that there's a substantial share that ranges on the very negative to slightly negative results and how they would feel about this. And this is similar in the Western countries, but also in Taiwan. Only China sticks out with a higher share of positive views on it. So this is an interesting result, because Taiwan, on the other things, is often very much in line what Chinese respondents say. And we can see this also here on the next slide. It looks overwhelming at first, but I'll talk you through. So we have the three technologies. It's here ocean alkalinity enhancement, macroalgae with sinking, and macroalgae farming with BECCS. So these are always the technologies. You always have the countries from in the same sequence here. And after introducing the technologies, we asked people what associations they have. We gave them a list of associations, associations with the technology, and we gave them a list. And the list contained positive associations. I clustered them here for the analysis in natural, innovative, environmentally friendly, and feasible, or also negative associations like harmful, risky, costly, or uncontrollable. We also asked them whether they had additional associations. They could write that down in free text, but they didn't. They mostly asked questions or gave comments. They didn't have specific associations that turned up a lot. So this is basically what we get. And here you can see the rectangles. They are the share of people, the share of respondents that chose this association in the respective country for the respective technology. So the very light shading here for Canada is about 13%. That means 13% says, oh, I feel OAE seems natural to me. A dark shading, here, for example, in Germany for macroalgae farming with sinking, there 31% said, oh, this seems uncontrollable to me. So, and just to direct your gaze a bit, so the picture we see then is that positive associations for OAE are very rare. It's a bit different here in the Asian countries, but still. And if we go down to macroalgae farming with BECCS, where we also have a co-benefit, and which is, I haven't shown you this result before, but which is the most positively viewed technology of the three, we see that also positive associations are a lot stronger and higher in their shares. And on the other hand, you see the reverse picture. You have all the negative associations here in OAE and the positive or a low level of negative associations with macroalgae forming and sinking. BECS. The only thing, again, be reminded again of your result from Taiwan before. Here we have high shares of Taiwanese respondents saying this seems harmful and risky to me. So they're more along the lines of Western countries than along the lines of China. So summing this up, so we have a very low level of awareness about marine CDR. This is just something, and what actual public opinion will be in the end, we don't know yet. What we can do now with the studies we do is like initial thoughts, initial associations, what people come up with spontaneously. And they might have forgotten a week later that they responded to this kind of survey. What public opinion will be in the end will be more determined by how politicians act, how stakeholders act, who takes it up, how the media reacts to these kinds of approaches, or also what in the end scientific results will be. It's obviously also a factor. But the other results we also had was, in this case, stemming from the focus groups, is that respondents in the discussions were very much focused on changing consumption patterns and reducing emissions. So they were not jumping to, oh, great ideas, let's just do them. They were, oh, it seems a bit dangerous, it seems problematic, let's concentrate on reducing emissions first. But at the same time, they were also a bit like, okay, but still research it to have this back door open to maybe use some of these approaches. But their focus was on changing their ways because they didn't want to add more pressure to the oceans and the environment of the oceans because they do care about the oceans and ocean pollution. And this is also something we find because they have a hard time engaging with CDR in general, but then they come up with other examples they used to. So we did one of them in Norway, and there was often arguments about aquaculture and salmon farming, how it was harmful to the environment and how it was hurtful with new species being in or lice and problems of aquaculture. And Germans often came up with associations with marine pollution. So we shouldn't pollute the water, we shouldn't add plastic pollution. So adding rock dust felt to them like polluting the ocean and not necessarily helping the ocean or the climate. So these were associations they had, and we had, as Andreas also said, it's been always the biological thing. So people were very happy to hear about blue carbon management and mangroves and seagrass meadows, while they were not that happy about alkalinity enhancement, ocean fertilization, or upwelling. And in the deliberative survey, we then find that land-based options are actually perceived more positively than ocean-based. So it's not the thing that they think, okay, let's just do it in the ocean, push this problem into the ocean and keep it away from the land, despite the trade-offs we have on land with biodiversity, with land use, with potentially food prices. They still prefer land-based options over ocean-based options. And this is also partly because of this, we don't know enough about the ocean in general. So they were often concerned about the deep sea and what is in the deep sea and what we might put down there if we, for example, sink macroalgae. But also, it seemed very uncontrollable for them. So, for example, with upwelling, if these pipes break loose and then they're swimming in the ocean, that's a problem. So they were very concerned. It's not the ocean as the dump, and it's not the way they see it. And we also find if you want to do deliberation and participation, what to expect is deliberation does not change perceptions per se. It's doesn't mean you give them a lot of information, at least the way we gave them information, that they will then be more positive towards technologies. If you have a different approach to providing information, that might change. But the way we did it, we tried to provide information, but be rather neutral or frame it neutrally. It did not change how they viewed the technologies. So in the before measurement and in the after measurement, people had more or less the same opinion. But what did change was their uncertainty. So after 4 hours of deliberation and asking questions to experts, they were more willing to say something. They were more willing to give an answer from very positive to very negative and not say no opinion or don't know. So it's always a caveat to have engagement doesn't mean that then you get acceptance in the end. And another thing that was rather consistent, even though we have different levels of perception between the different countries, we found that the ranking of technologies is very consistent across methods and across countries. So ocean alkalinity enhancement normally is the least positively viewed, followed by sinking, and marine BECCS is viewed rather positively. So this is a summary of what we know currently about public perceptions with, I'm very sorry, a very Western focused view. And now I think the next one will be a bit more, or Lucas with the next presentation will dive more into why should we actually do and care about publics and what they think. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Merck, for your presentation. I think perceptions matter, and of course, it's going to be very hard, as you said, to tell people not to dump things into the ocean and then to dump millions of tons of things into the ocean. So yes, there will need to be solid scientific research that these methods are doing more good than harm. Yes, it's going to be an interesting way forward. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm now going to introduce our third speaker for today, Dr. Lukas Tang, who holds a PhD on the ethics of carbon pricing from Humboldt University of Berlin, and has been a postdoctoral researcher in the Climate, Ethics, Sustainability, and Global Justice Research Group in the University of Kiel's Department of Philosophy since 2021. Dr. Tang, you may have the floor.
Thank you for the introduction. I hope you all can hear me. I'm just quickly sharing my screen. I hope you can see the presentation mode right now. I can't see you right now, so if anything's wrong, please just someone speak up.
It's not in presentation mode at the moment. It's in editor mode.
Okay. Then I'll stop the screen sharing for now, then do it in presentation mode, and then start the screen sharing again, hopefully. Better now?
No, still in editor mode.
Okay. Okay, in that case, Cosmin, could you perhaps just share your screen, because I sent you the presentation, and then
Sure.
I'll, just like Andreas, tell you to click very often.
Just 1 second.
Now, thank you. That did the trick. Yeah, thank you once again for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. I will give you a short talk about procedural justice and marine carbon dioxide removal. And what I will do, essentially, what I try to do are two things, really. First, to explain a bit like what is procedural justice and what role does it play in the bigger project that I happen to work in, and what role should it play in the bigger whole that is evaluating marine carbon dioxide removal options. That's the first thing. And the second thing I want to do is, like in typical philosophers fashion, I want to raise like one specific problem, one specific challenge that I think one faces regarding procedural justice of marine carbon dioxide removal. And I will mostly focus like on the problem, on the challenge, not so much offer a solution, but just laying it out there. Yeah, with that, I think we can proceed to the next slide. Yeah, I'm working on a project called Asmasis. We can click again, I think, which is part of this bigger research mission, CDMR, that also Andreas and Christine are a part of. We can click to the next slide. And this Osmosis project. Cosmin, could you click to the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. is a project within this bigger research mission CDR-MARE and stands for the Unified Assessment Framework for Proposed Methods of Marine CDR and Interim Knowledge Synthesis, catchy title. And our task is to develop a transdisciplinary evaluation framework for marine CDR options as the base for a uniform evaluation of different marine CDR options. And that should be able to act as a nucleus for further homogenization with the evaluation of CDR options on land later on. So very shortly, like, we're framework builders. What we do is we conceive of an evaluation framework, of an assessment framework for marine CDR, and then we use that framework on specific methods, on specific projects. But essentially, like, we're putting this framework out there, not just for us to use, but of course, but for others to use as well, with the hope in the background that this is something that can, like, assist decision makers, assess the academic community, but potentially also assist the wider public in making up their mind about, as we will come to that, about the feasibility of various MCDR options and about their desirability. Within this project, there's a strong emphasis on non-natural science aspects. So the project does not only include natural scientists, but legal scholars, social scholars like Christina, for example, but also philosophers, ethicists, people working on moral philosophy. And this is something that I'm working on and that also has, like, left its mark in the assessment framework that you will see in a second. And why that? Why include people like us? Well, we think if you only want to assess feasibility, which you can do, if you only want to assess what can be done, we don't think there's a good reason to include philosophers. But if you want to do more, if you also want to evaluate not just what can be done, but perhaps what should be done, what, like, are things that are not just hopeful, not just possible, but hopeful or problematic, to look at the negative side and to provide input on these discussions in the societal sphere, then at least I hope that it makes sense to include this normative expertise, this ethical expertise as well. And yeah, that is our job within Asmalis. You can click, please. Yeah, and just very briefly, like, this is the current state of what we have produced, the Asmalis assessment framework, unpublished so far, but that will soon change, hopefully. And as you can see, like, one of the main, perhaps the main, we think, improvement compared to previous assessment frameworks, because this isn't the first assessment framework, at least when we talk about climate options in general. If we talk about marine CDR, this is pretty specific and new, but if we talk about the climate options in general, this isn't the first assessment framework. One thing that we do differently is that we explicitly distinguish between assessing the feasibility of various options and assessing the desirability of various options. And after two talks that had this tour de force character, you will be very pleased to hear that my plan is not to go through the entire framework with you in this talk. That wouldn't be possible, but to focus on one dimension, in particular the justice dimension that you see on the right, that essentially concerns the question, like, what impacts will there be on humans? Are they fairly distributed? And then also a question about fair governance. And this is the question that the rest of this talk will mainly focus on. So you can click one more time, please. So yeah, I will focus for the rest of this talk in particular on two criteria within this assessment framework in particular, namely the transparency criterion and the compliance with the qualified all affected principle criterion. These two are the criteria of procedural justice within this framework. And procedural justice, what this means, what the concrete contents of that are, that is what we will now turn to. You can click again, please. Yeah, so procedural justice, what is that? The basic idea is that marine CDR projects can be just or unjust. You can also say fair or unfair for the purposes of this talk, so that these terms can mean the same. And they can be just or unjust in more than one sense. Like, the most prominent sense is what philosophers call distributive justice. That's the question, like, what effects will MCDR projects have on people? Like, what benefits and burdens do they bring to people? And how are these benefits and burdens distributed? On whom do they fall? Like, what patterns of distribution do they form? And do these patterns of distribution align or do not align with principles of justice? For example, are there certain groups that seem to have to bear like extraordinary big burdens, for example? Do burdens fall on people in the global south? Do burdens fall on people who are poorer rather than richer and often therefore have lesser options to deal with these additional burdens? Like, these are questions asked within distributive justice. Important, but not the only question, not the only game in town, so to speak, we think, in terms of justice, because there's also questions about procedural justice. And these essentially concern the question who has what kind of say in decision-making processes connected to marine CDR. Does the governance of marine CDR align with certain principles of justice, namely principles of procedural justice? And the idea here is that, like, say, a certain marine CDR project seems to be completely harmless from the perspective of distributive justice. Yeah, it has some burdens, but they are relatively minor, and it has some benefits as well. That doesn't seem to be like a particularly problematic pattern of distribution among them. The idea is it can still be unfair to do this project without like hearing locally affected people, without including people in decision-making processes. It really is an independent question what kind of say people should have in these decision-making process. And there's the intuition that at least some people should have some kind of say. So not making decisions over the heads of people is a starting intuition here. So just to clarify, because this is often conflated, I think, this question of procedural justice is not identical with questions like what governance is demanded by current legal frameworks. Like, current legal frameworks ideally are informed by certain ideas of procedural justice, but they may or may not be. It may be the case that we want to ask further questions that are currently not covered by the law, or that maybe even that the law asks questions where we say, well, just from a purely justice kind of perspective, we don't actually think these questions are all that important. So legal questions feature in the framework we created on the legal feasibility side, but not so much in the procedural justice part. Also not identical with the question what involvement in decision-making processes is necessary to limit local opposition. For example, it's not simply about, how much contribution to decision-making processes do you need so that there isn't a movement, say, a public outrage against that. Public outrage may be a sign that something has gone wrong from the perspective of procedural justice, but we're really asking a question not about just, a question about political feasibility here, but a question about justice. So rather the question that asked by procedural justice is, what kind of governance of marine CDR options do we owe the people? What moral rights do people to be part in decision-making processes connected to marine CDR options? And why care about these questions? Well, essentially for two reasons. One is the hope that acting in accordance with norms of procedural justice, and we will come to that in a second, is a tool to eventually end up with better decisions, not to make like rash decisions that ignore the plight of locally affected people, for example. That's one reason. But there's also just the intuition that it's just fair. It's just fair to include people in those decision-making processes. Never mind whether the decisions will be better or worse from what point of view anyhow. It's still, for such decisions to be legitimate in a moral sense, they have to take an eye on matters of procedural justice. And with that, we can click to the next slide. So yeah, what norms of procedural justice are proposed in the discussions about CDR in general? I can already say often it's on CDR in general, not so much about marine CDR in particular, but what norms play a role in these discussions. Well, according to our analysis, essentially two. They come under different names, of course, but we think it can be boiled down to two. First, a norm of transparency, and then a norm of fair participation. Let's start with transparency because I think it's the way the more straightforward case and the one where we will not talk about too much in this talk. So the norm of transparency very broadly seems to say something like relevant information about the CDR projects or the MCDR projects in question and their effects should be made publicly available. You can click one more time, please. This, as I said, is relatively uncontroversial, both in the academic debate and also in wider circles, as my impression at least. Such a duty may know some limits, for example, when novel technologies and patents related to them are under consideration. But it seems with these limits in mind, it seems generally accepted that such a norm of transparency is a plausible norm of procedural justice that MCDR projects should adhere to. The interesting one is the fair participation one. To that we can click now. So there's one principle that dominates by far the discussion about fair participation. This is the so-called all-affected principle, saying very broadly, those affected by a CDR project or MCDR project ought to have a say in its governance, and this say should mirror their degree of effectiveness. So if you are affected, say you're a locally affected person from some side effects, be it positively affected or negatively affected, it's just about effectiveness, you should have some kind of say in the decision-making process. You can click, please. Well, regarding this principle, there's not so much controversy on the theoretical level. So it's not so much that people say, no, we should reject this principle altogether. The principle itself is widely endorsed. Basically, it's the only game in town when it comes to fair participation. But when it comes to marine CDR, we think there's a major open question on what this means in practice. Like what exactly is demanded by these all-affected principles in terms of affected people having a say in those decision-making processes. You can click once again. Yeah, now we come to the problem. We think the central problem in applying this principle saying that affected people should have some kind of say in the decision-making processes, is that there are two countervailing considerations here that make it quite difficult to find a way to apply this principle in a plausible manner. On the one side is the fact that some forms of marine CDR may have considerable local negative side effects. So you can find people affected by local side effects, and these are a paradigmatic case of people often negatively affected by marine CDR. As an example, think of fishermen who are burdened by marine areas being close to fishing activities because, say, of ongoing subseabed storage activities, of say, pipeline activities, shipping activities, and so on. So that's on the one side. And it's a highly plausible desideratum that decisions regarding MCDR should not be made over the heads of these locally affected people. So they should sit on the table. They're locally negatively affected people are a paradigmatic case of people who are affected, and according to that principle, they thus should have some kind of say. They should be included in the decision-making processes. And even it seems that, like, if you take this intuition seriously, that the decisions shouldn't be made over the head of affected people, one might even think about something like veto rights for locally affected people, saying, no, if it's like the people say we have a project in a coastal area and the people living on that coast just hate this project, that not just for like political reasons, then we maybe should stop such a project, but that it would really be unjust for reasons of procedural justice. However, there's this other consideration. MCDR will hopefully have global and intergenerational climate benefits. There are other people who are hopefully affected by these measures. Who are these people? Well, people threatened by climate change, other paradigmatic cases of people positively affected by marine CDR. Other people could be positively affected by marine CDR as well, like if there are local positive side effects, for example. But when we look at the primary aim of these projects, the beneficiaries are ultimately the people who are currently threatened by climate change, and by making a difference to climate change by means of marine CDR, we try to help. And this is, in a nutshell, like the basic idea why we think about this whole thing. So think of people threatened by extreme weather events, could be decades from now, perhaps people even who are unborn as of yet. And unlike the people on the other side of the coin, who these people are is often unknown and currently like fully unknowable. That's like, when you could call it a problem of the invisible beneficiaries of CDR, insofar as some negative side effects might be local, visible, some benefits, or this essential aimed for benefits are dispersed through time and space. Now, but it is a highly plausible desideration that the beneficiaries of MCDR should also count as affected by it, positively affected by it. So they should sit at the table too. And at least it seems worth thinking about whether these benefits might be even be something that, for reasons of justice, should be something that has the potential to override local opposition. So what we end up here is a picture of, on the one side, people who are identifiable, who can actually raise their own voice in political processes, especially if they're negatively affected. And yeah, they should sit on the table. That is true. But the other side of the coin, the beneficiaries, at least many of them, seem to be unidentifiable, dispersed through time and space. And this kind of provides a certain imbalance that could feature in decision-making processes. We can click to the next and final slide. So the call here would be that fair participation must balance these two considerations. So every solution, every decision-making process that looks at only one side of the coin, either at locally negatively affected people or only just at the beneficiaries, is missing something crucial. So yeah, locally affected people must be heard and included in decision-making processes, but we must recognize that they are not the only affected parties. The invisible beneficiaries, so to speak, of marine CDR must also sit at the table. And it is very much an open question how to do this. But certainly imperfect solution must be found. Otherwise, it seems like we have a high risk of NIMBY, of a not in my backyard phenomenon. And this is not just a problem of political feasibility. The problem is not just that there will be this opposition and in the end we can't do things, but like not looking at both sides of the coin actually is a problem of justice. We're not hearing one of the groups that should be heard. This, we think, is one central challenge in the procedural justice of marine CDR. Thank you. And thank you for clicking through the slides.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tang. Your emphasis on the need for justice in these discussions was crucial. And I think you've very well highlighted that while local involvement and contacting local stakeholders is essential, it must though be balanced with broader considerations. Yes, and I think your perspective helped us understand the complexities and ethical dimensions of marine CDR. Thank you very much. Now, this ends the presentations for today, and we can open the floor to the participants who have already asked some questions in the Q&A in chat. And also, you may raise your hand if you'd like to be given access to microphone and video. I think we can start by taking some of the questions from the chat now. Let's see.
Okay. If I may, Cosmin, there are some, I've moved all the questions from the chat to the Q&A, starting from the bottom, which are addressing the first speaker, moving on up.
Very good. Then let's start with Sonia, who asked, although they are productive, marine vegetation, such as seagrass meadows, are complex to grow as they are sensitive to the environmental conditions. Are you aware of any experiments for seagrass meadows cultivation? And do you think that iron can be used in this case to accelerate their growth?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, we do a first set of small-scale experiments to regrow, recultivate seagrass meadows in the Baltic Sea. And this is basically in areas where we know seagrasses were present, meadows were present several decades ago. So these areas can be have the right environmental conditions. So that depends on sediment type, depends on nutrients, temperature, water quality. I think that this is relatively straightforward in areas where we can recultivate areas that have been, where we know seagrasses were present. And that's the case in many parts of the world ocean, of coastal areas, because seagrasses are in decline still. It's similar to forests on land, and they are in decline mostly because of pollution and light availability. So water quality is the main harm to most seagrass meadows. Once we stop pollution, there's a high chance to be successful in replanting and recultivating seagrass meadows. Temperature, ocean warming is an issue. So some seagrasses, they have temperature limits which are very close or maybe at the margin of current temperatures already. So we may have to select species that can tolerate higher temperatures. And this is mostly, well, changing, going at different lower latitudes closer to the tropics and expand the range of seagrasses. This has, of course, environmental problems when we have invasive species, basically a species that was not there previously. And that might bring its own symbionts, its own ecosystem, its own viruses and diseases. And so this could be eventually harmful. And that's what's happening in parts of China right now, not with seagrasses, but with macroalgae, that these invasive species take over existing ecosystems because they are well adapted to increasing temperatures and maybe different light levels, nutrient levels. So that, I think, is the main risk. And then the iron question, iron is usually not limiting, though since they are close to the sediment and they have, in most areas, enough iron from the sediment in these coastal environments. These are usually not iron limited areas.
Okay, I'm going to take two questions together because they both revolved around ocean liming. Basically, both Kathleen Hasse and Ayodele were asking what are the effects of ocean liming on marine animals and plants? How many of these effects are still unknown? How will we know that migrating sea creatures won't be affected, and also seabirds, sea turtles, sharks? And ultimately, will this lead to a reduction in marine biodiversity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's a very important question, and that's one we have, I think, the most critical question that we have to address. And we have tried to address it with experiments in bottles, in tanks, in the lab, and now in these mesocosms that are enclosed areas in the ocean. So far, these have enclosed plankton species, so phytoplankton, zooplankton, and fish larvae. And we can't do much more on these experiments. Then we would have to try it out in the field, in the open ocean. And that puts another legal and ethical questions. Should we do it? Who should give permits? And who should control and say if things go wrong and would have to be stopped? But from all the experiments we have done so far, we know that the main effect is a reduction in CO2 in the water. And so that leads to slower growth of some algae. So they grow because of their CO2. That's how they do photosynthesis. And this is going back to pre-industrial conditions. Right now, the ocean is enriched in CO2. That's what we do in greenhouses. We pump CO2 into the greenhouses so that tomatoes and all the plants in there grow faster. And that's what we have done with the ocean over the last decades as well. So algae now in most parts of the ocean grow a little faster because there's more CO2 available to them. And this is turned back by ocean alkalinity enhancement. There's less CO2 available, so most algae will grow a little bit slower. It does not apparently decrease total production, but it can change seasonal cycles. It can change also the animals, that the food is available at different periods of the year. And so this could be a critical part where we have to basically pay attention to, and which I think can be studied only at field trials, which have their own problems, legal permit problems, ethical, societal problems, who decides what can be done in the open ocean. And if there is some effect, we cannot just take the alkaline material out again. Of course, we can stop putting in more, but the effect will be there. It's not a runaway effect. And we do see these alkalinity concentrations. They are not poisonous. We see these in close to coral reefs. We see them to some areas in the tropical oceans, particularly, which have very high alkalinity, or fjords, where glacial meltwater is coming in at high latitudes. They also have these rock dust at very fine grained grains and put in a lot of alkalinity. So we don't expect completely different ecosystems, but we expect shifts in species. And fish and higher trophic levels, usually we expect they are well protected by their skin. They can survive even very acidic or very alkaline waters, but it will cost some additional energy if they have a different environment. So they have to renew the skin faster, maybe if the skin is affected, or so that costs more energy, will cost more food, and might be a disadvantage for some species. But the levels that we think could be added in terms of alkalinity will always be between pre-industrial and today. So basically, we are in some range of ocean chemistry that the ocean has seen over the last 2 centuries. So it's not completely unexpected for biology as a whole, but it might be new for the species living there right now.
Thank you very much. We are getting close to the end of the meeting, so both for the speakers and the participants, please keep your interventions brief. I'm seeing that there's a request from Office. I'm going to allow you to share your webcam and microphone. Please introduce yourself first, since I don't have a name. There you go. You can now unmute.
I put my name, but I don't know why it shows this Office there. I'm sorry. I'm Sunil Muridhar Shastri. Thank you, Cosmin. Thank you, Antonella, for this excellent webinar. And thank you, Andreas and Christine and Lucas, for your, fantastic talks. I have a specific question for Andreas, very quick one, and a couple of very quick questions for anybody who might want to answer. The first one is to Andreas, actually. In your last slide where you showed, last pictorial slide where you showed a number of Baltic Sea things, and there you showed things going up from historical times until 1974, and then there was a reduction in 1994, and then it's gone up again. So that was why that's happened. The other question, which is general, a couple of general questions are, between CDR and CCS, and taking into account precautionary principle, I would think CCS should be the more, preferred option. But what's your thought on between CCS and CDR? Perceptions, we talked, both Christine and Lucas talked about perceptions to some extent. Is this perceptions of experts or Joe blogs, or Jane blogs? So that's one. And short-term impacts versus long-term good, because obviously I'm going to be up in arms if I'm going to lose my livelihood in the next 5 years. But if the next 50 years are going to be good, then what about that? And my final question, really, very quickly, is, there's decades, sometimes perhaps maybe even longer, maybe a century lag between CO2 increase and climate change impacts. And likewise, when we start reducing the CO2, the reduction, the amelioration of carbon, climate change is going to be, again, decades away. So, what are your thoughts on that? I want to be optimistic, so please give me an optimistic answer. Thank you.
I could start briefly. So Baltic Sea,
and let me plug your.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. We all have a look at it. Baltic Sea. So that was the area of suboxic and anoxic waters that is expanding overall. But in the 70s, there was a fresh water, saltwater inflow from the North Sea, bringing in a lot of salty water, but with a lot of oxygen that lasted for a few years. And then the oxygen was respired again. So that's interannual variability. Then CCS and CDR. Yes, CCS, I think, has to be done anyway, and it's very efficient, putting large amounts of CO2 into the ground, and I think it can be done in most places, in many places, with very high safety standards. But it can only be used for CO2 that we have somewhere concentrated in the pipeline. And many of our emissions are not concentrated, like cement plants, they're concentrated, or wastewater, waste incineration. But agriculture is distributed, and some heavy transport would be distributed, and this will be emitted into the atmosphere. And then we have to get it back, the dilute CO2 back from the atmosphere. And there we need CDR, direct removal from the atmosphere, not from a pipeline or point source. The optimistic one, leave the others to the others, is we only need net zero emissions. So once we have reached net zero CO2 emissions, global warming will stop. So at least it won't get worse. and we can reach net zero, and we have to reach it in the next few decades. And I think that's what we can achieve so far. Then we can talk about decline and cooling later on, but stopping warming is the first thing, and that I'm very optimistic we can do it. Thanks.
Dr. Mark, would you like to add to this from the perception perspective?
So one part is, I agree with Andreas about the CCS and CDR, and also don't forget that in many approaches that would do CDR, so would also include CCS as storage option, because it would still be geological storage if you do bioenergy with CCS or direct air capture with CCS. And it's a relatively stable and permanent storage compared to a seagrass meadow that a big storm can actually destroy or really throw back again, or any kind of external influence. On the perceptions, the studies we do, or I did in this case, was in layperson. So it's regular people you meet on the street. We recruited them online. And I have a hard time being optimistic, I admit, because we haven't really lived up to the challenge of reducing emissions. And CDR is an option, but any CDR is not an easy option. It's expensive. Also, like low-hanging fruits like seagrass restoration, if you really want to actively restore seagrass, current research is that we actually have to take seeds or like saplings from living seagrass meadows and replant them. And that's very labor intensive. So I have a hard time being optimistic, especially with climate pressures adding up, and adaptation will be more and more the focus of where the money goes. So the earlier we do something, the better for everything, for CDR as well as mitigation.
Thank you very much, Sunil, for your question. I'm going to take now another question from the chat, which is from Ayub Omar. How are the rights and interests of local and indigenous communities living in or dependent on marine ecosystems being protected and incorporated into the procedural frameworks for marine CDI? Dr. Tang, I think this one's for you.
Yes, I've also quickly written on it in the chat already, but just very quickly, in the assessment framework that we built, there are essentially 3 places where that features. So one thing that sets our assessment framework apart from some other proposals is that we have a dimension purely concerned with environmental ethics, in that sense, meaning like we evaluate not just those impacts on nature that eventually will have knock-on impacts on humans, but we think that the effects on nature also matter in and of themselves. So for example, when we have negative effects on ecosystems, of course, that's relevant because it ultimately may affect people, but not just because of that reason. So the environmental dimension is something where I think our framework is quite strong on. But when we look at the knock-on effects that the question also asked about local indigenous communities, basically it features in 2 spots. Like the right of these communities to be heard features in the procedural justice criteria that I talked about today. But the impacts on them themselves, whether they are, for example, overburdened, they also feature in this justice dimension, but in the distributive justice part. And one reason to include not just the question, okay, what impacts will there be, but also like what patterns do they form? Like who will be burdened more, who will be burdened less? One motivation for that is to ask questions like, okay, do burdens, for example, fall on marginalized communities that already experience significant burdens. This is for us one of the motivations of asking these questions. So yeah, features 3 times in the framework as a whole.
Thank you. I think these will be the last 2 questions that we can take. How can coastal ecosystems, such as mangrove, seagrasses, and salt marshes, be effectively utilized in climate mitigation strategies?
Yes, that goes to me. So well, they can be utilized if they could be counted to the national emissions. So mostly these are national territory, and for mangroves that already applies. Since that depends on whether you count that as ocean or as land forest. And I think that is then could be, well, each state can decide how to reduce emissions, at least to some extent. There are some upper limits in the nationally treaties. And I think that is the most direct way to give basically carbon credits whenever you establish these systems in your territory. You have to make sure that these last, that these are durable carbon stocks and carbon credits thereby. But this would be a financial incentive. And in many places, I think that could work very well. In addition, you can ask, you can look at all the side effects, the co-benefits, as in coast protection, home for biodiversity enrichment, for also blue economy in some places. And so this should be counted in, but at a different account. And it's important, I think, not to mix up the 2 effects, to make sure if we want to talk climate, we really have to count carbon. And if we want to pay for climate benefits, we have to count carbon and pay for the counted carbon and make sure we do it only as long as the carbon is really there. And then we can trade all the other hopefully positive effects as well via different mechanisms. But I think it's under local control. So each state it's in the national waters, national coastland. They can do it, and many states do it either via tax reduction systems or via direct carbon trading systems. So that is well possible.
Thank you very much. Now, our last question, which is from Suleiman Hussein. Which approach, physical, chemical, or biological, or another method should be prioritized for CDR from the atmosphere, and why?
Well, I could start. Well, we have to do everything. So none of these will be sufficient. So first, we have to reduce emissions. That's the easiest things and the most effective things. And there we are safe. Any carbon not emitted is not there, and we don't have to worry about durability and all that. So and we have to do, that has to deliver more than 90% in any case. And then for CDR, I think what we can do is blue carbon. We know it doesn't do harm to the climate, at least. And so it's whenever you have land that can be used for a mangrove plantation, why not do it? And I mean, we know basically how to do it. And protect it, make sure it's not cut down again. And then I think really the big leverage in the end is chemistry. And that's maybe my personal viewpoint, but I think that's really what we can do, where we can have a large impact on the atmosphere by dissolving alkaline materials. And we have to do it in a safe way. We have to do these field trials, test, does it have impacts on the environment? But we think we have to start very, very quickly with that in order to be prepared. And we have to find out what does not work. We have to be fully transparent. Each experiment has to be published and be made available to everybody, particularly the failed experiments. They are usually the experiments we learn most from. And that's why we have a best practices guide we just published last year, where we put up the current best practices of alkalinity enhancement research to accelerate knowledge generation and make this fully transparent to allow everybody to look at it. I'm very confident there are many ways that can work even and scaled up in time, but it will not be easy, and many things will not work as well as we hope. And so we have to be prepared. We have to be fully transparent, since it will be work in the open ocean. It's an open heart operation, basically, we do. And we have to be very cautious, and we have to include all actors, all people that will be hit by the consequences. And we have to, well, justice is really an important issue there. But transparency from a scientific point, from an experimental point, I think is the essential requirement we have.
Thank you very much. And that's it. I think we've been through all the questions.
We have.
Antonella, I don't know if you'd like to add something before we close.
Maybe just a couple of impressions that I got. First of all, I have to thank the speakers, because this was really interesting personally, and also I think it links a lot with what the IOI as a capacity development and a training organization tries to do. I find that there were very many interesting overlaps in the speakers' presentations. But one thing that struck me throughout is the maybe I'm biased because I'm speaking on the side of IOI, but the importance of developing capacity, of training people. Also when it comes to decision making, policy making. So on the one hand, I really appreciated Andrea's very thorough presentation, which presented the options that are out there, the pros, the cons, where we need to emphasize more, where more information is needed. I really appreciated as well Christine's presentation, because she mentioned very much how important it is to get people on board, people on side with this, because we know from everyday observation of our life around us, when you get people on board, when you inform the public, when the public understand more, there's a greater chance of maybe cooperative behavior. I totally agree with the comment that carbon not emitted into the atmosphere is the best kind of carbon. So in terms of literacy, climate literacy, ocean literacy, there's a lot of work to do with lay citizens. But I also understand that the kind of cross-disciplinary learning that we get by having 3 experts like you here is really critical to people, IOI alumni, early career ocean professionals, people who are going to go back to their offices and make their decisions, their country's policies, influence their country's policies. And finally, I really appreciated Lucas's points about what in the past maybe used to be gathered all together under the word eco-justice, right? And I was very grateful for you to define further for us the ramifications of these kind of decisions that many people here will go back to their office and have to consider. So I appreciated very much the three facets, the 3 maybe viewpoints you bring to the consideration of this question that we posed is, can the ocean be a climate champion? I think the answer to this question is still in the open. There's a lot of potential. There's a lot of things that still need to be determined, not least impact on current and future generations, the justice of taking certain pathways or making certain decisions. And I really, really appreciate your presenting us with these dilemmas, these issues, these problems, these solutions. And I'm really, really impressed by the questions from the floor, the involvement of the audience. And I would like to thank you all for this. we, I think, come out of this webinar enriched with knowledge, but also challenged with new questions, which I think is the perfect balance for every webinar. Thank you for making this happen for us. Thank you, Cosmin, for bringing this together and managing it so well. So a big thank you on our behalf as well.
Same from me. Heartfelt thank you for our great panelists today and everyone who joined us. I hope we shall be seeing you in September for the third webinar. And you'll be getting very soon the invitation for that one as well.
Yeah, and some teaser on the next topic, maybe.
Yes.
So thank you very much for being
Thank you very
here,
much.
all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you
Goodbye.
very much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. See you at the next webinar. Take care.